Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here again with another review for you. This time I'm going to be talking about episode 9 of season 1 of Ultimate Spider-Man called Field Trip. Overall this is an alright episode, but after the complete and utter crap fest that was last week's episode, an alright episode seems like a humongous improvement. Now this episode is a big shout out to the classic Thor story where Thor does get turned into a frog by Loki. Now this story came out when I was a kid and way too young to really be into Marvel comics and Thor or anything like that. So honestly, I can't really say that I know very much about the story other than the fact that Thor got turned into a frog, and even many years later, the story certainly has a pretty hefty degree of fondness, despite its goofiness, among longtime Thor fans. So it's not really a surprise, given the rather zany at times nature of the show, that if they're going to do Thor, that they would go and do an episode that would focus on that particular aspect of Thor. So anyway, let's talk about some of the things that were going on in this episode. Okay, now the first thing that I noticed when I was watching this that really didn't make sense to me was that Danny can read ancient Norse runes, even though he learned all of his crazy kung fu stuff in some mystical city in China. Now, okay, it certainly is. Now, Kunlun is literally a place that's out of time magic city, sort of like Shangri-La. So it's not entirely out of the realm of possibilities that they would have access to information about Norse runes. I mean, as I said, it's Shangri-La, quite literally, for all intents and purposes. But it just really seems like a stretch, or at least something that they could have maybe remarked on a little bit more. But that's probably just me being a little overly picky. Now, I don't think I'm being overly picky when I point out that for whatever reason, in this episode, the school principal is not only going on the field trip, he's leading the field trip and seems to, in fact, be the only person of authority from the school there. Now, I want you to think about any kind of field trip that you may have gone on as a kid. How well do you think that would have gone if there had been exactly one teacher leading the whole shebang? One teacher. Folks, I work with kids. That is my job. I work with them every day. And yeah, if you had a horde of kids out roaming around in a big museum and there's just one teacher there to try and hold it together, that is going to be a complete and utter disaster. Now, I guess you could probably make the case that he's there to keep an eye on Spider-Man and the Amazing Friends, but really, exactly why would he feel the need to do this on a field trip when he doesn't really seem to interact with them very much when they're at school, or even when they're out doing superhero-y stuff, where he would certainly be much more effective, much more in a position to actually do something helpful. Here he's just there to read a silly book about Norse mythology. So anyway, when we do finally get to see Thor, his introduction is handled pretty well. Spidey gives those people who may not be very familiar with Thor the lowdown on who he was, and that little shout out, doing the introduction so it seemed like Thor was a rock star, was actually in my book pretty cool. It seemed like maybe a small nod to all the really good Scandinavian rock and metal bands out there. Although I just kept thinking about how they're sort of associate, at least to me anyway, when I think of those sort of bands, the first group of guys that come to mind are Sonata Arctica, who, while a band I definitely enjoy, are not really the sort of guys I would really put together with Thor. But again, that's just probably quirks of my particular personality bleeding through a little too much rather than any actual flaw with the show. And honestly, I've had the band on my mind recently because they've got a new album coming out soon. Anyway, let's continue on. It was nice to see Thor reference Coulson as the son of Cole. A very nice shout out to his very amusing line from the Thor movie. And Loki tricking Thor into, you know, into a bad spot by using Thor's ego, his hubris against him. That's very classic stuff. And this continues on later on when Thor has to apologize and humbles himself before the dwarf. Again, a lot of the part of Thor's character in a lot of Thor's stories are simply Thor's ego gets in the way and he has to learn a lesson in humility in order to succeed. Now, you would think that, gee, after all this time, you think that maybe having this lesson pounded into his head again and again, maybe it would get through to Thor a little bit. But no. And frankly, that's actually rather in keeping with what we see on this particular show in regards to the Amazing Friends. Now, it was established right from the very get-go of this show, in the first 2 episodes, that the reason Spider-Man is there helping teach these guys is that out of all of them, he has the most experience. He is there to function as the leader to help them become better heroes. And yet, just like last week, for no really good reason, the Amazing Friends absolutely refuse to listen to Spider-Man, even though, despite continuing to display a little bit of immaturity, which is perfectly understandable for someone his age, Spider-Man is the one who is being smart, who is giving good advice, and the Amazing Friends just will not freaking listen. This is one of the things that is sort of driving me nuts about this series, is that, as I have said, they keep making the point that Spider-Man is the more experienced person and that the other heroes really do and should learn from him, but they completely and utterly, for no discernible reason, refuse to listen to Spider-Man or to learn any sort of lessons from him, even though it has been pointed out that they're just as capable of making mistakes as he is, and that when the chips are down, it is Spider-Man is the one who will step forward and be the leader that people need to get things sorted out, and that is what he does. He even shows himself to be superior in strategy to a freaking god of war. No, okay, Thor is technically a thunder god and all that, but come on. That's what Thor does. He is a warrior god, but Spider-Man, the 15, 16-year-old kid from Queens, understands better when it is time to retreat and regroup than the freaking warrior god. And the Amazing Friends are still not in a mood to listen to him. I swear. But not that Spider-Man's leadership is without his flaws. Now let's take a step back to the museum. When Thor's talking about, yeah, this is Loki, blah, 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 he's my brother, he's always doing all this crazy stuff, but I will use Loki's greatest weakness to defeat him. Spider-Man at no point bothers to ask, hey Thor, what is Loki's great weakness? Even though Thor, who is Loki's archenemy, his half-brother, and the guy who, probably more than anyone who is not named Odin, knows Loki, is standing right next to him. And he doesn't think to ask, what is the vulnerability of this incredibly dangerous villain? And it's not as if Thor would have any reason at all to keep that information to himself. In fact, the more people who know what Loki's greatest weakness is, the better. Of course, Loki's greatest weakness is never actually told to us, but the show, I will give them credit for this, and I hope that this was deliberate, is that they don't need to tell us what Loki's greatest weakness is because it's blindingly obvious that it's his own ego. Just like Thor's own ego is his biggest weakness. And to be fair, when he is pointed in that direction by the dwarf, Spider-Man figures it out fairly quickly and is able to exploit it well. So here we have Spider-Man having proven himself to be a better strategist than a war god and capable of tricking a trickster god. Dollars to donuts, folks. I'm thinking that the next episode, the Amazing Friends are still not going to be any more inclined to freaking listen to Spider-Man, even though he has proven himself to be smarter than 2 gods. Oh boy. Anyway, speaking of Loki, I swear, I don't think there are pig farms anywhere in the world that have as much ham as Loki did in this episode. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. It certainly does, in a lot of ways, harken back to just how, from the standpoint of many decades later, how cornball a lot of the 60s comic books can be. In fact, just this sheer level of hamminess reminds me an awful lot of the Flash Gordon movie from 1980, which, that's a real kick in the pants movie to watch. And the beautiful thing about it is that there is no nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We know this is ridiculous to the audience. It is played by everyone in it completely and utterly straight. And that, folks, is a thing to behold. It's also interesting that Brian Blessing from that movie was actually the guy who was originally up for the role of Odin, but they ended up going with Anthony Hopkins instead. No knock on Brian Blessing, of course, but I think Anthony Hopkins was the superior choice there. But anyway, let's continue on. Now, the one thing that I did like best about this episode was the dwarf guy, whose name I really didn't bother to write down, points out that the flaw in all of the amazing friends, and he nails it quite perfectly. White Tiger, her big thing is that she's always picking out the flaws in other people. Nova has a severe lack of patience. Danny is overly cautious. Luke is afraid of his own power. And Peter is still somewhat reluctant to step in there and be a real leader. And I genuinely am hoping that this message finally sinks in and we see the amazing friends start to really grow as characters a little bit more. Honestly, while they have had their moments as these episodes have worn on, it just doesn't really seem like there's been progress. And anytime we do get to see a little bit of acknowledgement, a little bit of growth in them, it seems like the reset button gets pushed back by the end of the next episode. It just doesn't really seem like the characterization is going anywhere on this show. And if that's the case, then I just find myself wondering, why should I keep bothering? Now, shows like The Simpsons sort of run on continuity is sort of a maybe thing. I mean, Bart Simpson has been 10 years old since what, about 1987, 1988? And for a show like The Simpsons, that's a necessity. But here, in a show like Ultimate Spider-Man, if this show really wants to kick it up a notch, to really be something that fans are going to remember, it's going to need to let the characters genuinely grow and change. Well, folks, I think that's all I really have to say about this episode. Again, not a terrible episode, but it mostly gets points on for not being as bad as last week's episode. And that's all I really do have to say. Anyway, folks, until next time, take it easy and have a good one. Oh, and as always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter as Who's Your Jedi. Goodbye.